The milk sitting in your fridge right now almost certainly came from a cow that has never once grazed on Australian pasture. That is not an exaggeration. That is the direct, predictable consequence of a price war that started in 2011 and has never stopped destroying the farming system that was supposed to sit behind that carton. In 2011, Coles launched $2 a 2-litre home brand milk. Woolworths matched it within 48 hours. Aldi held the same price point. The idea was simple: drive foot traffic through price leadership, absorb the loss on milk, and make it back on everything else in the trolley. Clean, efficient, devastating, because someone always pays. And in the Australian dairy industry, the people who paid were the farmers. The farm gate price, the amount a farmer receives per litre of milk, collapsed to a point where it no longer covered the cost of producing it. Dairy Australia's own figures put the cost of production for a well-managed Australian farm at between 55 and 65 cents per litre depending on region. The farm gate prices that major processors were paying as recently as 2023 sat at 54 to 58 cents per litre in some contracts. At the bottom of that range, farmers were losing money on every single litre that left their property. The carton was still on a Coles shelf for $2.40. The margin exists. It just doesn't go to the farmer. What happened next is what happens in every industry when price becomes the only competition. The weakest participants exit and the survivors industrialize. Australia had approximately 12,000 dairy farms in the late 1990s. Today, there are under 4,500. That is not natural attrition. That is the consequence of a pricing structure that was never designed to sustain the farming behind it. The farms that survived did it by going bigger, going indoors, going intensive. Cows on concrete, total mixed rations, grain-heavy diets, 3-shift rotary milking platforms running around the clock. Because at $2 a 2-litre carton, there is no margin left for farming done properly. What this means for the milk in your fridge is something no supermarket label will ever tell you. It means the milk you pour into your coffee every morning may have been blended from dozens of different farms across multiple states, processed through facilities handling millions of litres per week, and packaged under a label that implies freshness, locality and care, none of which are actually required to appear on that carton under current Australian food labelling law. We went through every major milk brand currently sitting in Australian supermarket fridges. Here are the 8 you need to think twice about, starting with the most serious, and the 3 that are actually still worth buying. Number 8. Paul's Full Cream Milk. Paul's was founded in Queensland in 1931 and became woven into the fabric of dairy culture across the state and beyond. It is a name that carries weight, a name that generations of Australians grew up trusting, and that trust is exactly the problem. Today, Paul's is owned by Lactalis Australia, the local arm of the Lactalis Group, the largest dairy company on earth by revenue, headquartered in Laval, France, with operations across 51 countries. This is not a local operation with Queensland values. It is a global industrial machine that acquired the Paul's brand as part of its expansion into the Australian market. And the milk now runs through Lactalis processing facilities under the full industrial supply model that entails. In 2020, Australian dairy farmers, the national industry body, raised formal concerns about farm gate prices being offered by major processors, including Lactalis. Farmers supplying Lactalis reported receiving prices that made continued production financially unviable, contributing to the ongoing exodus from the industry. The Australian Dairy Farmers Alliance has repeatedly called for mandatory code of conduct provisions to prevent processor market power from being used to suppress farm gate returns. Those calls have been partially addressed. The consolidation has continued regardless, but here is what puts Paul's at number 8 on this list. In 2018, Lactalis products were at the center of the largest food recall in French history, a salmonella contamination in infant formula produced at their Créon facility in France. Products affected were distributed across 83 countries. 83. The Australian arm operates under FSANZ supervision and has not had equivalent domestic incidents. That is important to state clearly. But what investigators found in the aftermath was not just contamination. It was a corporate response that included initial attempts to conceal the scale of the problem. A company that sells milk to Australian families, now confirmed to be owned by a multinational whose documented response to a food safety catastrophe was to attempt to minimize and delay disclosure. Paul's milk is legal and safe under current FSANZ standards, but the organization behind the label and its established approach to accountability is something every Australian consumer pouring a glass of Paul's should understand. Number 7. Devondale Long Life Full Cream Milk. This one is going to surprise people, particularly the people who think they are making the right choice. Devondale is probably the most widely trusted milk brand in Australia among consumers who actively care about supporting the domestic dairy industry. It carries Australian dairy farmers' co-op branding. It uses the language of farmer ownership, Australian heritage and quality. It is positioned explicitly as the choice for people who read labels and make deliberate decisions about what they buy. Here is what the label does not tell you. Devondale Long Life Milk, the range most commonly available nationally across both supermarket chains, is UHT processed, ultra-high temperature, heated to above 135 degrees Celsius to achieve shelf stability measured in months, not days. The processing requirement is disclosed on the packaging because FSANZ requires it for products sold at ambient temperature. But the brand equity of Devondale, the cooperative story, the Australian dairy farmer positioning, the premium presentation, creates an impression that is very difficult to square with what UHT processing actually does to milk. When milk reaches those temperatures, heat-labile bioactive compounds degrade significantly. Immunoglobulins, the natural antibodies present in fresh milk, are destroyed. Lactoferrin, which has documented antimicrobial properties, is largely denatured. Research published in the International Dairy Journal has confirmed that UHT processing causes measurable reductions in these compounds compared to low-temperature pasteurization. Protein and calcium largely survive. But the full nutritional picture of genuinely fresh milk is not just protein and calcium. The bioactive fraction takes the hit, and no amount of cooperative branding changes what heat at those temperatures does to a biological fluid. The dairy co-op dimension behind Devondale is real, and it does matter for farmgate pricing. Murray Goulburn's collapse, the predecessor cooperative, was one of the most damaging events in Australian dairy history for farmer equity. The processing assets were subsequently acquired by Saputo Dairy Australia, a Canadian-headquartered multinational. The Devondale brand continues to be positioned around Australian farmer ownership. The processing operation is now run by a company answerable to shareholders in Canada. There is something particularly pointed about the Devondale situation. The brand that most explicitly positions itself as the choice for informed, conscientious consumers, the one that leans hardest on the language of farmer ownership and Australian dairy heritage, is the one that most requires you to read the fine print to understand what you are actually holding. That is not a coincidence. Premium positioning and cooperative branding are the most effective tools available for commanding a price point above home brand. They work precisely because they appeal to the consumers who are most likely to care about the things that UHT processing affects. The marketing is aimed directly at the people most likely to be disappointed by the product. The irony is not subtle. Number 6. Dairy farmers, full cream milk. Dairy Farmers is one of the oldest names in Australian dairy. Founded as a cooperative in 1900, that heritage still radiates from every centimetre of the packaging. The problem is, the heritage is the brand, not the business. In 2008, the Dairy Farmers Cooperative was acquired by Kirin Holdings of Japan. The brand became part of Lion Dairy and Drinks. Then, as part of Lion's restructuring, the Dairy Farmers brand transferred to Bega Cheese, a listed Australian company, the cooperative structure that once gave the brand its meaning. Farmers owning the company that processed their milk, farmers being the direct beneficiaries of the business they built, is gone. What remains is the name, the logo, and a price point that sits above home brand but below the premium tier. The milk runs through processing facilities across New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. Pooled supply, industrial scale, standard homogenization, and pasteurization. Structurally, it is no different from the products on either side of it on the shelf. What you are paying for, above the home brand price, is a story. And the story ended in 2008. The transition from cooperative to corporate ownership is not unique to dairy farmers. It is the defining story of Australian dairy at scale. Peters, National Foods, Paul's, Dairy Farmers, almost every brand that built a genuine following by being locally owned and farmer-controlled has passed through the same door. A Japanese beverage conglomerate, a French multinational, a Canadian processor. The names on the cartons stayed Australian, the ownership did not. And because Australian food labelling law does not require disclosure of corporate parentage on consumer packaging, the story on the front of the carton has continued without interruption, while the business behind it changed hands entirely. You deserve to know that the cooperative is gone. What you are buying today is industrial milk dressed in Australia's dairy history. Number 5. Extended Shelf Life Milk. Pick up a carton in the chilled dairy section and check the use-by date. If it is more than 3 weeks away, you are not holding fresh milk. You are holding something that has been through a process specifically designed to disguise that fact. Extended Shelf Life Milk, the kind with a 45 to 60-day use-by date sitting in the refrigerated section, occupies a deliberately ambiguous position in Australian supermarkets. Refrigerated presentation makes it look and feel like regular fresh milk, but achieving that shelf life requires either ultra-high temperature processing or microfiltration so aggressive that the milk's biological profile is fundamentally altered before it reaches your glass. Food Standards Australia, New Zealand requires UHT milk to be labelled as such when sold at ambient temperature. But some extended shelf life milks undergo near UHT processing, sit in the fridge, and avoid that label entirely. The proteins have been heat stressed. The enzymes that help your body process dairy are denatured or destroyed. The beneficial bacteria present in minimally processed milk are eliminated. Research has confirmed that heat treatment intensity correlates directly with reductions in bioactive compounds. A milk with a 60-day shelf life in the chilled section has been through something that genuinely fresh milk has not. The benefits of that extended shelf life flow entirely to the supermarket and the processor. Less waste at the distribution level, fewer urgent deliveries, lower logistics costs. What flows to you is a product that qualifies as fresh milk under Australian labelling law while being nutritionally meaningfully different from milk consumed within days of production. Real fresh milk does not last 60 days in a refrigerator. If yours does, that is the supply chain speaking, not the dairy. The easiest diagnostic in the aisle: check the date. If you cannot identify which brand you are holding, because this applies across multiple private label and branded products from several major processors, the date alone tells you what you need to know. Number 4. Woolworths Select Full Cream Milk. Woolworths sources its own brand milk through a network that includes Lactalis Australia, the same French multinational behind Paul's, which we covered at number 8. That is not a coincidence. It is the clearest illustration available of how concentrated Australian dairy processing has become. Woolworths Select and Paul's Full Cream Milk both run through Lactalis processing infrastructure, which means the farmer supplying milk in many parts of Australia does not have two buyers competing for their product. They have one buyer wearing two different shirts. The competition that is supposed to drive better farm gate returns and higher quality standards simply does not exist in the way the label architecture implies. When you reach for Paul's instead of Woolworths Select because you want something better than the home brand, you may be paying more money to the same company for milk sourced through the same system. Woolworths was named in a 2023 ACCC inquiry into supermarket pricing practices. That inquiry found the gap between farmgate prices and retail shelf prices for fresh milk had widened significantly over the preceding decade, with the benefit of that widening going to retailers and processors rather than farmers. The report is publicly available. The milk is still on the shelf at the same price. There is also the macro-organic range to address directly, because Woolworths uses it as a deliberate shield in this conversation. When the practices behind the standard Woolworths Select range come up, the macro range is the answer. We sell organic too. We give consumers the choice. And the macro range is a genuine exception. It does involve different supply chain requirements, and we will acknowledge that. But the macro range exists alongside a system that the standard Select range actively sustains. One premium option positioned to absorb consumer concern, while the product driving the volumes that define what Woolworths actually means for Australian dairy farming continues unchanged. One ethical line in a sea of industrial output is not a solution, it is a pressure valve. Number 3. Supermarket own brand A2 milk. Since the A2 Milk Company turned A2 protein content into a mainstream consumer conversation in Australia, both Coles and Woolworths have introduced own-brand A2 variants at prices significantly below the branded product. And for consumers who have made the switch to A2 based on genuine health considerations, those products look like a welcome relief from premium pricing. The issue is what the supermarket A2 ranges are not disclosing. The A2 claim refers to beta-casein protein composition. Standard Australian dairy herds are predominantly Holstein Friesian cattle, which produce milk containing both A1 and A2 beta-casein proteins. True A2 milk comes from cows carrying two copies of the A2 gene, producing only A2 beta-casein. The A2 Milk Company tests every cow in its supply chain to verify genetic status. The network is specifically built around verified A2-producing animals. The supermarket own-brand A2 products must verify A2 protein composition to use the claim, so the protein profile should be correct. But the testing protocols, supply chain management, and farming practices behind them are not disclosed in equivalent detail. Choice Australia noted in a 2023 review that Australian labelling requirements for A2 milk are less prescriptive than consumers often assume. The claim speaks to protein composition, but says nothing about how the cows were raised, what they were fed, or whether the farming practices are meaningfully different from standard industrial dairy. The supermarket A2 products cost roughly half the branded alternative. That difference exists for a reason: lower-cost supply chains, less verification overhead, less investment in farming standards. If A2 protein genuinely matters to your health, understanding what you are and are not getting at the lower price is worth your time. The wider problem is what this situation reveals about how quickly a meaningful product innovation gets absorbed into the same industrial model. The A2 Milk Company spent years building a verified supply chain around a specific biological claim. Within a short period of the brand gaining traction, both major supermarkets had introduced alternatives at half the price, using the same language, on shelves positioned directly next to the original. The regulatory framework treats this as legitimate competition. You are entitled to draw your own conclusions. Number 2, Coles' own brand full cream milk. The blue and white carton is on almost every Australian shopping list because Coles is the brand, because the packaging is clean and simple, because it sits in the fridge of a supermarket most Australians visit every week. The assumption for most shoppers is that this is something reasonably straightforward. It is not. Coles does not produce this milk. It is contract manufactured primarily through Saputo Dairy Australia, formerly known as Warrnambool Cheese and Butter. Saputo is a Canadian-headquartered multinational that acquired the Warrnambool operation in 2013 after a contested takeover, giving it control over a significant share of Australia's dairy processing capacity. The same Saputo, as it happens, that now owns the Devondale brand we discussed at number 7. When one company processes milk for the country's biggest supermarket at volumes required to supply stores from Cairns to Hobart, the result is something that looks like a simple carton, but is the end product of a highly centralized industrial chain. Milk is sourced from farms across multiple regions in Victoria and South Australia, pulled into massive tankers, processed in batches large enough to supply Coles nationally. When milk is blended at that scale, individual farm quality becomes irrelevant. High-quality milk from a well-managed pasture farm goes into the same tanker as milk from an intensive indoor operation, and the product averages everything down. You cannot trace it. You cannot know what those cows were fed or whether they spent any time outdoors. And Coles has no obligation under current Australian food labelling law to tell you. The processing is standard industrial, high-temperature, short-time pasteurization, aggressive homogenization that permanently breaks the fat globule structure, so cream never rises to the top, standardization to meet the regulated fat percentage, and packaging in plastic that University of Tasmania researchers have flagged as a potential microplastic contamination concern over time. If the Coles home brand carton was required to carry the same disclosure transparency that pharmaceutical packaging carries, it might read something like this: milk blended from intensive indoor and outdoor dairy operations across Victoria and South Australia, processed by a Canadian-headquartered multinational at industrial scale, homogenized to cosmetic uniformity, sustained by farm gate contracts that as recently as 2023 sat at or below the cost of production for a well-managed Australian farm. Instead, it reads, full cream milk, fresh, nothing else required by law. Number 1, and this is where it lands, Aldi Farmdale full cream milk. After everything just covered, salmonella recalls in France, UHT processed as fresh, Japanese conglomerates wearing cooperative clothing, Canadian multinationals behind heritage brands. Aldi Farmdale is number 1 on this list, not because it is the most dangerous. It is not. It is number 1 because it is the most honest representation of what has gone wrong with the entire category. Farmdale is a house brand created for Aldi Australia. The name sounds local. The carton carries pastoral imagery, green fields, simple design, the visual vocabulary of small-scale farming. The price is low but not absurdly so, which gives it an air of reasonable value rather than obvious compromise. None of it is real. Farmdale does not correspond to a specific farm, a specific region, or a traceable supply chain. Aldi sources its fresh milk through processor contracts that vary by state. In Victoria and New South Wales, much of the supply runs through Pactum Dairy, one of Australia's largest white-label milk processors. Pactum processes milk for dozens of different brands and supermarket labels simultaneously. The milk in a Farmdale carton comes from the same pooled industrial supply that fills cartons for numerous other labels processed at the same facilities, on the same equipment, on the same day. When Choice Australia investigated supermarket milk labelling in 2022, they identified exactly this kind of manufactured rural imagery as a form of consumer deception. Visual cues on packaging implying small-scale farming and natural processes, when the reality is industrial pooled supply with no meaningful traceability. The nutritional consequence is real. Grain-fed cows in intensive indoor systems produce milk measurably lower in omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid compared to pasture-raised animals. Research published in Food Chemistry has confirmed that milk from cows with substantial pasture access contains significantly higher levels of these beneficial compounds. Budget-processed milk does not come from those cows. But here is why Farmdale is number one. Every other brand on this list has spent decades and millions of dollars building trust, a cooperative story, a regional heritage, a health positioning, and then use that trust to sell you something different from what the brand implies. Farmdale never pretended to be anything more than cheap milk in a carton with a picture of a paddock on it. In a category defined by the gap between what the label promises and what the product delivers, Farmdale is at least honest about the fact that it is not trying very hard. That is a low bar, but in this aisle, it stands out. Now the three that are actually worth your money, because despite everything just covered, genuine quality dairy still exists in Australia. It is not hidden. Some of it is even in supermarkets. You just need to know exactly what you are looking for. The markers that separate real milk from industrial output are not complicated. Certified organic means the cows must have substantial pasture access under Australian certified organic and NASAA standards. Dairy cattle must graze on certified organic pasture with no synthetic pesticides, no GMO feed, no routine antibiotic use. Unhomogenized means the fat structure has not been mechanically destroyed for cosmetic uniformity. The cream rises naturally and you can see it. And genuine supply chain transparency means the company behind the label can tell you which farms supply the milk, how many farms, and what standards those farms operate to. First, Norco Full Cream Organic Milk. Norco is the only farmer-owned dairy cooperative still operating in Australia at meaningful scale. Established in northern New South Wales in 1895, it remains in the hands of its member farmers today. That structure matters enormously. Norco is not accountable to Kirin shareholders in Tokyo or Lactalis executives in France. It is accountable to the several hundred Australian dairy farmers who are its members. Their interest is in fair farmgate returns, quality standards, and long-term sustainability, because the cooperative's success is their financial livelihood. Norco pays its members farm gate prices consistently above the industry average. Independent price monitoring by Dairy Australia has shown Norco sitting above the major multinational processors in farm gate returns across recent reporting periods. The farmers producing Norco milk have a direct financial incentive to maintain high standards because they own the outcome. The Norco Organic range is certified by Australian Certified Organic, guaranteeing pasture grazing requirements, prohibition of synthetic chemical inputs, and verified supply chain integrity. Processing is done through Norco's own facility at Lismore, and the shorter supply chain means the milk reaches shelves genuinely fresher than the national industrial brands. You can find Norco in Woolworths and independent supermarkets across New South Wales and Queensland. It costs more than home brand. That difference is what ethical farming and cooperative ownership actually cost. Money flowing back to Australian farmers rather than to shareholders in Canada or France. The comparison that matters is not Norco versus Coles home brand on price per litre. It is Norco versus Coles home brand on what you are actually paying for. At Coles, the margin between farmgate and shelf price flows to Saputo and to Coles. At Norco, the member farmers own the processor. The margin that Saputo would have taken stays within the cooperative. The higher price is not because the milk is fancier, it is because the system behind it is not designed to extract value from farming at every point in the chain. Second, Paris Creek Farms Biodynamic Organic Milk. Paris Creek Farms is a family-owned, certified biodynamic and organic dairy operation in the Adelaide Hills of South Australia. The farm has been operating since the late 1980s and maintains a direct, traceable supply chain from a defined group of certified farms to shelf. Their cattle graze on certified organic pasture in the Adelaide Hills. The milk is processed at a scale that means less heat, less homogenization pressure, and more of the naturally occurring bioactive compounds remaining intact than in anything produced at industrial volume. Paris Creek offers unhomogenized full cream milk. That means the cream layer is visible at the top of every bottle. That is not a defect. That is what milk looks like when it has not been mechanically processed into artificial uniformity. The fat globule structure is intact. The natural creaminess comes from the milk itself. The Paris Creek range is certified by NASA, the National Association for Sustainable Agriculture Australia, which provides independent third-party verification of all farming and processing claims on the label. When you read certified organic on a Paris Creek bottle, that claim has been audited, not self-declared. The unhomogenized detail is worth pausing on because it is more diagnostic than it might appear. Homogenization was introduced primarily for cosmetic reasons. Consumers associated cream separation with spoilage, so processors began breaking fat globules mechanically to prevent it. The cream top product we now associate with premium or artisan dairy is simply milk that has not been altered to prevent what it naturally does. Part of what you pay for with Paris Creek is the absence of a process that was added specifically to help industrial milk pass as something it is not. Paris Creek is available in select independent supermarkets, health food retailers, and directly through their online store. It is one of the clearest examples in this country of what dairy looks like when the business is built around farming quality rather than processing volume. Third, your local independent dairy. The best milk in Australia is not on a supermarket shelf. It is coming directly from small regional dairies, selling through farmers' markets, farm gate outlets, local independent grocers, and home delivery services that most people in this country have never tried to find. In every Australian state and territory, small dairy operations exist, some certified organic, some biodynamic, some simply family-run grazing properties with nothing to hide, selling directly to local consumers at prices that are higher than supermarket home brand, but considerably lower than you might expect, given what you are actually buying. In Victoria, producers across the Gippsland and Otways regions supply directly through farm gates and local retailers. In Queensland, smaller organic operations in the Darling Downs and hinterland supply farmers' markets with fresh, unhomogenized product every week. In New South Wales, the Northern Rivers and Southern Highlands have concentrations of small dairy operations with direct local sales. In Western Australia, the Ferguson Valley has dairy farms supplying local retailers and markets directly. To find what is available near you, the Dairy Australia Farm Locator at Dairy. GMO allows you to search producers by postcode. State Farmers Market Associations, the Victorian Farmers Markets Association, Farmers Markets Nest Dadders, RQFM in Queensland, list dairy stallholders at each market. A straightforward search for fresh farm milk or unhomogenized dairy, plus your suburb will surface. Producers who do not have the marketing budget to appear in mainstream retail, but have the product you are actually looking for. When you buy from a small local dairy, every dollar goes to the farmer who produced it. No multinational processor margin, no overseas shareholder collecting the difference between what the farmer was paid and what you spent. That is the most direct vote available to you in this system, and it is available in every part of this country. Here is what to take away. Next time you are standing in the dairy aisle, ask 4 questions. Who actually owns this brand? Not the Australian-sounding name on the front of the carton, but the corporate parent behind it. How long is the shelf life? Because genuine fresh milk from well-managed local farms does not last 6 weeks in a refrigerator. Is there any third-party certification on this label? Australian Certified Organic, NASA, Demeter Biodynamic, from a body that has actually audited the farming practices rather than just accepted a fee. And does this product tell me where it was made, by which farms, under what standards? Or does it just show me a picture of a green paddock and expect me to fill in the rest? If the answer to 3 of those 4 questions is nothing or I cannot find it, you know what you are holding. The decision Coles made in 2011, and that Woolworths matched within 48 hours, transferred the cost of cheap milk from supermarket profit margins onto the backs of Australian dairy farmers. 12,000 farms became 4,500. That is not natural attrition. That is the consequence of a system designed to extract value from farming rather than sustain it. The ACCC has investigated supermarket pricing power. The Senate has held inquiries. Industry bodies have submitted evidence. The squeeze is documented, official, and on the public record. And the milk is still on the shelf at the same price, processed by the same multinationals, disconnected from the farms that produced it by supply chains so long and anonymous that traceability is essentially a foreign concept. You cannot fix the whole system in one shopping trip, but you can make a different decision with your own money. Find Norco in the fridge and put it in your basket. Look for Paris Creek at your local independent grocer. Find your nearest dairy farmer's market stall and talk to the person who actually milks the cows. And know, when you pour that milk, exactly where it came from, how the animals were treated, and whether the farmer who produced it was paid fairly. That is what the industry does not want you to do, because the moment you start asking those questions is the moment cheap milk stops feeling like a saving and starts feeling like what it actually is. Tell me in the comments, which brand have you been buying? And now that you know what is behind the label, are you going to change it? Drop it below. I read every one. Hit subscribe if you are not already on the channel. There is a lot more coming, and the dairy aisle is just the beginning.